Welcome everyone. Today we've got Zach Gordon. No, I said it wrong. Zach Warder-Gabaldon with us today. Now Zach has over 20 years experience with Healthtech in Silicon Valley, and he's going to be chatting to us about his background working with different Healthtech startups, software, hardware, different design and engineering sides and management sides of the startups that he's been involved in. So really excited to have him in. And just another reminder to please check in the chat where you're tuning in from and what startup you're a part of, and to get thinking on those questions you might have for Zach. Otherwise, I'd love to pass on to Zach to do a little bit on his backgrounds.
Sure. Thanks, Lilia. My name's pretty tough, so don't beat yourself up for that. Mom and Dad decided to join it together. So I usually like to start by telling people where I grew up, because that has a real profound impact on how I think, why I do what I do. When I work with companies, I often ask them, why are they doing this? What is their motivation? Because that's a really important question if you're embarking on a startup journey, whether you're an operator or a founder. It can be a long, hard road, sometimes a very lonely road. And so I grew up in the southwestern US. I hope I get the Te Reo Maori word correct, tangata whenua of the United States. I am 25% Indigenous Native American. And I mention that because my grandfather, when I was growing up, all of my lessons were about the legacy that I would leave behind. So from a very early age, I started to think about what would I do with my time? How would I help the most people? How would I help the planet? And that led me to, when I was finally at the time where I was going to uni, I went to Stanford University and I earned 2 degrees there in design and mechanical engineering. And I decided to apply those first in medtech. So quick definition for the audience, at least the definition that I use and I'm familiar with. MedTech tends to be more hardware focused or hardware plus software, something that would be used in a hospital setting, whereas Healthtech is primarily more software, but you might have something like consumer wearables hardware, but it's used outside of a hospital setting. It might be used in clinics or at the home, for example. So my journey in healthcare started in MedTech, in medical devices. I began in the engineering role. I worked a lot on manufacturing, prototyping, benchtop testing with animal tissues, and slowly I worked my way up into a product leader role, where I then started to oversee the regulatory pathways, budgeting, the feasibility studies, first-in-man clinical trials, some of the later stages that require a little bit more knowledge of the processes and a little more leadership. To kind of summarize quickly, and then I can dive in a little bit more as you like, I spent the first several years of my career in medical devices at one company, the first 4 years to be precise. And I was lucky enough to see that company go public. And so that was a really exciting experience, especially for a first timer. I had never been part of a company before at all, let alone one that was privately funded and then IPO'd. So that's kind of where I'll stop there for a moment, at least. That's my journey kind of through uni and my first medical device company.
Oh, awesome. We'd love to delve into what those kind of companies were involved in and the lessons you might have learned from your time with them.
Sure. The first company is now defunct, but at the time was called Kartika, and they were focused on cardiac surgery. So the devices that we made there the problem to solve was that cardiac surgeons would often be on their feet somewhere between 18 and 36 hours doing bypass surgery. Very, very arduous manual process where you'd have to harvest a graft either from the patient or from a cadaver and manually sew it on the aorta, manually sew the other end on the target artery that was blocked. So there's a lot of problems with that, whether you want to talk about cost, whether you want to talk about surgeon fatigue, repeatability. You're depending a lot on a surgeon's individual skill. We wanted to democratize that and standardize it a bit more. So we created several devices that would automate this and take about that 18 to 36 hour process down to maybe somewhere between 15 and 45 minutes, depending on how familiar you were with the device. So that was one company, and they started to branch off into cardiology areas as well. For example, the product that I led into clinical trials was a femoral artery closure device for cardiology. And I can go deeper into that if you want, but I'll talk about some of the other medical device companies. There was another company that was not a successful exit. I think it's important to mention these as well. It was an obesity therapy device company. Their name was Vibrant, and their product was to implant a silicone balloon inside the chest cavity where a full stomach would normally occupy. And the idea was, if we occupy that space, then a stomach can't expand and people can't continue to overeat. So obesity therapy. That was an important lesson for me. That was an important experience for me because I wanted to solve the root cause of obesity in addition to providing treatment. And I would, from time to time, pitch the CEO or the head of business development, or even some of the engineering and product team on software ideas that could help and coach people understand the root cause of why they were obese. Was it a genetic issue? Was it an environmental issue? Were people overeating? Was it a combination of both? Was it lack of exercise? Was there a mental health condition that was contributing to it? I wanted to bring that element in so that we could not only treat them and help them at that moment, but prevent them from having that happen again. That was not well received. So I was a little disenfranchised with that company. I ended up, that's my story, will kind of continue in that route a little bit later when we talk about digital health. But the third medical device company that I want to mention was a very successful exit. It was a company called NeoTract, and their product was called the Urolift. Instead of being used by a surgeon in the operating room in a hospital, it was used by urologists in a clinic, which made it easier to adopt and easier to use. The product ended up selling to a larger company called Teleflex for $1 billion. So that was pretty exciting to see a private acquisition in addition to the IPO that I had seen. So in each of those companies, I mainly played an engineering or product leader role. My title might have been principal engineer or product manager, but for the most part, I knew a lot about medical devices, material science, and the path that it took to go from idea on the back of a napkin all the way through the approval process so that you could actually start helping people.
Awesome. I've just noticed a few more people jump in here. If you missed start, we'd love if you could just check in the chat box where you're tuning in from and what startup you're a part of if you're a part of a startup. And also if you can make use of the Q&A box for any questions for Zach that you might think of along the way, and then we can get to the questions in the second half of the webinar. Awesome, cool. So you've mentioned, a bit about going from hardware to software. Would you like to delve into that a bit more?
Yeah, that's a really important transition for me. And I think people in the audience may be able to resonate or learn something from this transition. So after about 10 years in medical devices, and I think one of the tangents that we could come back to if you want, is during this time, I founded 2 companies of my own. One was a medical device company, and one was actually outside of healthcare. But after about 10 years in medical devices in different roles, I realized I was becoming a little bit disenfranchised with medtech innovation in general, mainly for 3 reasons. Number one, to tie back to that Vibrant story, I realized I really wanted to be involved with prevention. It could be treatment and prevention, or maybe just pure prevention. But medical devices come into a point and they help and they're critical. And I'm not downplaying that at all. But oftentimes the path that led people to the intervention isn't being addressed. And I wanted to work on that. So that's the first reason I moved away from medical devices. The second is personally, I wanted to be closer to that end consumer, that end beneficiary, whether it's the customer, the user, the patient. There's a whole bunch of possible nouns here, but I felt that the impact I would have, I would feel that reward if I were personally closer to them. And then the third reason, medical devices and hardware in general is slow. Anybody out there who's working on hardware knows this. You have to prototype something. Well, maybe you have to send out for the prototype. You have to wait for it to come back. And if there's a global pandemic and shipping is slow, you have to wait for that too, right? Software is faster. There are servers everywhere, and you can iterate on ones and zeros kind of at any time of day, whenever you want. So I wanted to see that quicker iteration speed for myself. Now, if you followed my story arc so far, I'm trained as a designer and a mechanical engineer. Physical products, I like working with my hands. If I'm moving into software, I'm not a software engineer. So I needed to decide how I could be closer to the customer, how I could contribute. And the answer, or my hypothesis, was in sales, BD, marketing, and commercial strategy. So for about 4 months, I put myself through a boot camp that was about 60 to 80 hours a week. And it was just chock full of some of the world's best mentors, teachers, internships, research, case studies. It was kind of like a mini MBA program. And the whole goal was for me to understand if I would be any good at this role and if I would enjoy it, if it would meet some of those elements that I was dissatisfied with in medical devices. And so that led me to a company called Welkin Health, Welkin. They were a B2B SaaS company that at the time was first focused on diabetes coaching, and then chronic disease prevention, and then eventually chronic disease management. I was the first salesperson there. Everybody else was kind of product or clinically focused. And so I was really charged with figuring out who our ideal customer was, how to sell to them, what the price points should be, really responsible for traction. It turned out that, one of the questions for myself was I going to be any good at this? Turns out that I was. In 4 months, which is pretty quick in B2B SaaS, I landed our first customer, and in 12 months, I landed our first multi-million-dollar customer. So that I started to see what was working, and I became the executive head of sales, where I built out an outbound sales team, SDRs, AEs, sales ops team, customer success team, started hiring for heads of marketing that I could worked with head of product. And I eventually saw over 5 years that company grow from 0 to 15 million in ARR. And it was at that point where I thought, okay, do I want to see this grow to 100 million, 500 million ARR? Or am I more excited about earlier stages? It turns out I am more excited about earlier stages. I like that difficult 0 to 1 stage. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, cool. Oh, well, that's awesome to grow it to that scale. And also that realization of what it is specifically that you do, enjoy and doing most, and you find the purpose in. So you mentioned, that you founded 2 companies. Yes, what came next after that?
Yeah, so this was during my time. So to go back to the timeline, I had uni, I worked for the company Kartika for about 4 years. At that point, I made a promise to myself, I kept a promise to myself to travel around the world. This is 2007, so people in the audience can probably figure out how old I am from that date. But this was the first time I actually came to New Zealand and fell in love with the country as well. And after 2 years of traveling, I went back to the Bay Area, and I thought the greatest impact, tying back to kind of my origins in the Southwest, the greatest impact that I can have, or I believed I could have at that time, was as a founder, kind of thinking of the multiplying effect. If I found a company that is doing good for people, and I hire good people, and they're helping do this mission, I would feel very good for that use of time. So the first attempt, my first founding, was for a medical device company. It's what I knew. And I founded it with a doctor and another engineer. And we developed a diagnostic device for sleep apnea for infants. This was an important lesson in early market validation. We had a killer device, great form factor, good design, all the things that the builders in the audience will probably resonate with, but we didn't do, or I should say, I didn't do my diligence. I didn't know at that time how important it was to validate a market early and often. Just get tons and tons of feedback of who will buy it, how much they'll buy it for. Should this be sold to a hospital? Should this be sold to a clinic? Should it be sold to parents? Right? There's all kinds of possibilities that need to be confirmed. My two co-founders had the audacity of becoming dads at the time. So we decided as a team that it was best to take our IP and hand it off to a friend of ours who wanted to continue the journey. At that point, I said, okay, I'm still in this belief that being a founder is the best way that I can make a big impact. So I teamed up with a data scientist from Google, and we founded a company that was focused on helping farmers transition from conventional agriculture to sustainable agriculture. Now, this might seem a little bit of a deviation, but I came at the project from a human health perspective, reading a lot, and I still read a lot about human health and nutrition, especially. Knowing what we put into our bodies is some of the best preventative medicine, dating all the way back to kind of let food be thy medicine. Hippocrates said that, the Hippocratic Oath. And he was coming at it from an environmental perspective. He wanted to help improve the land, and sustainable environment, agricultural practices can do that. So we both had two different goals, but we had the same idea of how to get those goals. We went through a startup accelerator in San Francisco. We went through kind of pitch day, and we were raising funds. And then my co-founder came down with a chronic disease. And rather than go it alone, which is very lonely, or try and find somebody else who had the same mission, the same ethos, the same values, which can be a hard find, I decided to fold the company. Either one of us had kind of the option to pick it back up again. We never did, but that helped me realize how much I wanted to be in chronic disease prevention, which ties back to kind of the choice to work for Welkin Health.
Oh, awesome. And then, yeah, so after that, was that when you then stepped into a role helping another startup with their sales, did you say?
Yeah, that's right. So I went through that boot camp after I realized being a founder, I guess I haven't said this yet, but those two instances taught me just how hard it is to be a founder, how long of a road it is, how lonely it can be, some of the mental health tolls that it takes. And so at that point, that's when I decided to redefine myself in sales and BD, and not focus on being a founder, but call it the lieutenant to the captain, call it being somebody's right-hand person, right? I wanted to and understood how important it was to affect strategic decisions, important big picture decisions, company culture decisions, hiring decisions. But at the end of the day, I didn't want the title of founder and CEO. It's a very hard title to shoulder. So that's when I redefined myself. And my first role out of that boot camp was actually in sales ops and understanding kind of the machinery of a sales process, right? What needs to be there in terms of software? What needs to be there in terms of SOPs or operating procedures? What needs to be there in terms of a sales playbook? What needs to be there in terms of sales collateral? The audience may be familiar with their things. If they're not, please ask. One of the gaps that I found here in New Zealand is there aren't a lot of senior sales leaders. So these terms may not be familiar to everybody. But that really taught me some of the vocabulary and helped me understand what I didn't know. And then I moved into that first sales hire role at Welkin Health in 2015 and was there through 2020.
Cool, awesome. And then, so you've left that role now, right?
That's right. So in March of 2020 was where I had that kind of another self-reflection moment, call it an inflection point in this journey. And at the end of 2019, my wife and I were beginning to put into place the move to New Zealand. It's something we had been thinking about since 2012, when she changed careers from clinical research to becoming a physiotherapist. And 2019, it really required at that time, we were both applying, but once 2020 and the pandemic hit, our way into New Zealand, was through her as a healthcare professional, as a physiotherapist. That's how we were allowed to move here during the midst of a pandemic when the borders are practically closed to everybody. And so we decided, once San Francisco and California went into lockdown March of 2020, we decided to sell most of our things and live a van life, live in a camper van for 12 months. So we left San Francisco officially around July of 2020, lived in the camper van and finalized all the things we needed to for New Zealand from the road. And we moved here in July of 21, went through MIQ, got out at the end of July, and we thought, wow, this is great. It's just like the news. COVID hasn't come to New Zealand. And then 2 weeks later, Delta came to Auckland, and we were like, it was inevitable.
That happens. Yeah, we're always a little bit behind the rest of the world, but we did get a good run during 2021.
Very good run.
You know, living pretty normally for a while, and I think we're kind of heading there at the moment. You know, everything's calmed down a lot, even though COVID's still out there. But yeah, no, that's awesome, cool. And so now, yes, you do quite a bit of consulting now, yeah, with health tech startups, and I know you help out at Te Ōhaka in Christchurch as well. Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about what you're up to these days?
Yeah, absolutely. So thankfully, because my wife was able to become a registered physio here and get a job that was requirements for our visa, that allowed me to take a little bit of time and realize what I wanted to do next, how I could help. I think it's clear, hopefully it's clear by now, after 20 years in Silicon Valley and 8 different startups, I love the startup energy. I've already said I like that 0 to 1 energy. And so I thought, how can I best contribute here? What's the best way for me to spend my time? How can I make the biggest impact? It always comes back to that question for me. And I looked at, maybe it's joining a particular company, or maybe it's becoming an investor. Maybe it's working in academia again. I had done that during my master's degree. And so the kind of true to what I know now, I basically did a whole bunch of market validation. I probably had 200 to 300 calls with different people in academia, in government. So your NZTEs, your Callahans, investors with the likes of Blackbird, Movac, Icehouse, Hillfrance, you kind of name it. I tried to find them and talk to them. With the incubators and accelerators, your creative HQs, your Te Ōhakas. And there were certain patterns emerging, especially around the gap in sales, BD, commercial expertise. And I thought, okay, this is a gap that I know, this is a gap that I can help fill. What is the best role for me to fill it? So I'm still, to be honest, I'm still validating and figuring out how I can make that biggest impact. But in the meantime, I started a company called Zia Innovation. And the ZIA, is the traditional Native American sun symbol from my home state of New Mexico. And through that company, I have some consulting clients and I work with them on a tactical level. I'm going to be doing some directing on a more strategic level. And if there is a need for it, I can do some angel investing, or I might invest as an LP at that level. But for the most part, I really like rolling up my sleeves. I like the tactical level. Just for the audience, I kind of see this as a hierarchy. Tactics are what you do on a daily basis. Your strategy, you might have different strategies throughout the year, maybe on a quarterly basis. Your plan is what you have for the year, and then your mission is kind of your 10-year vision that you don't really touch. So I really like being down and dirty on the tactical level. It's a lot of fun. I get to know the founders or the business leaders that I'm working with, or if I'm working with product and designers, I get to know them well as well. So that's how I'm occupying my time these days, between consulting clients, directing. I haven't started investing yet, but that might crop up. And then, as you mentioned, Te Ōhaka is the startup incubator here in Christchurch. And I'm an expert in residence there, which essentially means I am in person. I'm there to answer questions. For the most part, I go in once a week and I'm either there reactively. If people see me, they can come talk to me and I can help them out, or I'll proactively schedule meetings with people and set an agenda so that we know exactly what problems we need to tackle in our time together.
Yeah, awesome. Something that would be keen to delve into is in terms of, regulatory testing, so I'm guessing you did most of that whilst you were in the States, or have you had experience with that in New Zealand? Because I know, a couple of startups in our community have gone through that, or are going through that process of, the regulatory, requirements to be able to get a product out there.
Yeah, good topic. So I think one of the things that is probably new to a lot of healthcare entrepreneurs, especially if they've come from an industry that isn't heavily regulated, is that regulatory requirement. If you design a social media app, you can essentially design it, throw it out there, break it, test it, get feedback, and iterate it again. But with healthcare, it's a little bit different, right? The first thing is you really can't do harm. You really do no harm, right? You can't endanger anybody. You have to protect their privacy. It's very sensitive. And so often regulatory pathways come up very early. Even if you wanted somebody to test it, they're going to ask, well, do you have a CE mark? And I'll explain what that is. Do you have TGA approval for Australia? Do you have FDA approval? Have you done your feasibility studies? So the regulatory pathways that I am most familiar with are for the US, Europe, and Australia. And I think other countries often, they have their own bodies, but they often follow the leads of one of those bodies, one or more, just depends who. I'll speak most to the regulatory pathway in the US. It's the biggest market. It's also probably the most unique because its healthcare system is privatized. It's not a nationalized healthcare system. The regulatory pathway for, let's say, a medical device or a drug, or anything there are three classes: class 1, class 2, class 3. Class 3 tends to be the most severe. You can potentially do the most harm. So any kind of surgical device where you're going into somebody is class 3. A Q-tip or a tongue depressor is class 1. You can't really harm anybody with that. So the regulatory pathway really means, how are we going to take this idea and then prove that it's safe and effective? Those are the key words: safe and effective at different stages. And this could mean, well, first we're going to test benchtop in, let's say, I'll go back to my cardiac experience. We used sheep tissue because the cardiovascular system of the sheep is actually a pretty good proxy for human beings. So we would use sheep tissue in a lab. Once we had good enough results there, we'd say, let's use it on live sheep. Once we had good enough results there, then we could set up a small human clinical trial. And in each of these cases, you have different criteria: inclusion, exclusion criteria. And along the way, what you're doing is you're gathering clinical data. You're gathering this evidence to submit to a governing body, right? So animal trial, little human trial, bigger human trial with statistical power. At some point, hopefully, you get to a stage where you have a lot of data that shows this is at least as good, usually better than a gold standard. This is safe. It doesn't endanger people. You know which people it should be used on, what that exclusion criteria is, and it is effective for them. At that point, if you're lucky enough, you get an FDA approval. There are different pathways to do that. One's called a 510K, where you choose a device that is called a predicate device. You say, this is a better version of this, right? And then there's another path called a PMA approval, where you have to kind of say, this is brand new. No one's ever invented a time machine before. We're going to have to kind of build the road as we drive it. Once you get FDA approval, then you are allowed to sell. And at that point, there's still other challenges in getting reimbursement codes, and because the healthcare system there is quite a bit different. But regulatory pathway is basically validating scientifically, with hard evidence, with statistics, that your product is safe and effective.
Cool. And have you noticed, is that something that the startups that you're working with, are they going through that regulatory process at the moment? And have they encountered any issues or setbacks that you've noticed that, that insight could help out the community?
Good question. Most of the startups I'm currently working with don't yet have to go down a regulatory pathway. So in addition to being FDA approved, to use the US example again, you can be FDA reviewed, FDA cleared. Those are different terms. FDA reviewed means that you have gone through, someone at the FDA has looked and has confirmed you don't need regulatory approval. Now, both software can be classified as a medical device too. There's actually an entire category of software as a medical device. It doesn't just mean hardware. So the companies that I'm currently working with, they don't fall into that bucket of needing regulatory approval. Now, depending on where their innovation goes, they may need that. If they want to sell and grow in the US, they may need to look at whether they apply, whether software as a medical device, or if they're a software hardware company, they need to go down a regulatory pathway. I'd say the other kind of tangential topic to regulatory is compliance. So there's different kinds of compliance. Maybe you meet an ISO certification. ISO is an international standard. A typical one for medical devices is 13485, for example. Maybe you need to meet SOC 2 compliance for software security or maybe you need to meet HIPAA compliance in terms of healthcare. HIPAA is an acronym for the Healthcare Information Portability and Privacy and Portability Act, I think is, and that's in the US. So compliance is just as important as knowing your regulatory pathway. Even if you don't have one, you may need to be compliant, and there's a process to doing that.
Oh, awesome. And we're just in the second half now. So for anyone watching, if you've thought of any questions, if you've got any questions for Zach, even just for the terminology being used or regulatory processes or his experience with different startups, now's the time to chuck those in the Q&A box, and we'll start getting through those questions. So just one question that has come through is, what was the boot camp that you went through?
The boot camp's name was Tradecraft, and at the time they had 4 areas: sales and BD, UX design, growth marketing, and engineering. And I think they since scaled back. They scaled out engineering because there's a lot of engineering boot camps, development boot camps, but those were the 3 at the time, and I went through the sales and BD one.
Cool. What are the differences between selling health tech in the US versus New Zealand that you've encountered?
So far, I'd say, to New Zealand's credit, I think a lot of the founders here that I've met and a lot of the systems that are in place, and I'll give you a couple of examples, are more capital efficient. I think Kiwis have learned how to do more with less. And I think some of that is because the investment community they're not as familiar with health tech as, let's say, Singapore or Israel or the San Francisco Bay Area. So often the rounds that are raised here are smaller, forcing the Kiwi entrepreneurs to do more with less. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience can kind of resonate and speak to that. But I'd say that has built an ability that doesn't necessarily exist in the US. Because the rounds there are so big, entrepreneurs can be a little more wasteful. And I don't necessarily think that's a good thing. I think it leads to these competitive hypervaluation rounds where somebody raises a $10 million seed round, but really it's still a seed stage company. They haven't done the things that any seed stage company hasn't done: the market validation, the prototyping. So I do appreciate what I'm learning from the Kiwi entrepreneurs here in terms of what they're able to do, how they're able to hustle and kind of growth hack their way with less. I'd say another big, if you do need to do any kind of studies or trials, there's a difference there. But if you need to do any kind of validation, clinical validation, put it under that umbrella, it's a lot cheaper to do it here. And in some cases, it can be a lot faster. We're only talking about a nation of 5 million. So whether you're working at University of Auckland or University of Otago, or it's a collaboration with the University of Canterbury because it's an engineering, medical technology that you're innovating on, it can be really fast and a lot cheaper here. The US is so big that it can be kind of overwhelming and sometimes slower, and say, oh, well, to do that feasibility study, that's $2.5 million. You're like, $2.5 million? You can do it in New Zealand for like $250,000. So I think that's a real bonus that I'm seeing. overall, I'm seeing these patterns that to me make New Zealand a really great, I'll call it an incubation nation. I compare it a little bit to Israel. Israel is now a very mature innovation ecosystem, but at a time they were thought, well, this is a small country. What can they possibly produce? They punch above their weight class routinely with some of the things that they come up with. I think New Zealand has that potential, and that's what I'm speaking to when I mention capital efficiency, or when I mention, it's cheaper to innovate here. And then at some point, the market's not big enough. You do have to go to an Australia. You do have to go into Asia. You do have to go to Europe or North America.
Cool. I mean, that kind of answers a bit of the next question is, what do you see as the biggest opportunities and challenges in New Zealand? So I guess kind of.
Yeah, I'd say I'll start with challenges. I think right now, the ecosystem reminds me of the Bay Area in kind of late 90s, early 2000. Reminds me a little bit of Australia, and call it 2010 to 2012, and things are getting started there. Before your Canvas, before the culture amps, before some of those success stories. So one of the challenges I see here is, I'd say on the experience side, people who have seen what high growth looks like. Product leaders, sales leaders, entrepreneurs, different kinds of operators who have been a part of Vend or Rocket Lab, or maybe even going back to Xero's days. There are success stories that are happening now. And I don't mean success just in terms of fundraising rounds. Those are like medium successes to me, because a money raise is just fuel. Oftentimes people will say, they'll say, oh, we raised 20 million. Hey, congrats, that's great. It is great, but it's what you do with that money that's even more important. So I'd say having those people, having that experience, either as board members, as operators, if they want to go that route again, as investors, that's really, really important. That's a challenge. So this is almost a call to action for other people. If you know somebody who has seen that and done it, maybe they're Kiwis living abroad, maybe they're friends of yours who live in Europe, right? If they can act a little bit as mentors, as guides, that's really going to help bridge that gap and help people here know what great looks like on a global scale. So that's one challenge. I'd say another challenge is on the fundraising side. And I see this as I put the responsibility kind of on two parties here. I think there is a challenge to raise larger rounds so that there is a better chance to fulfill the company's mission and vision. So if investors continue to say, well, this entrepreneur, this company is asking for $1 million, we're going to give them $500,000, the investors are really shooting themselves in the foot to a certain degree, because they're not giving them enough fuel to run and operate fast, to make multiple mistakes, to figure out what works. This is what investors have learned in Silicon Valley. You still have to make a lot of bets. And even when you make bigger investments, most of them aren't going to pan out. But investors need to invest more so that entrepreneurs have a better chance at hitting those goals. And then on the flip side, the entrepreneurs have to push for more. They can't settle for less. If you need $1 million, if you think you need $500,000, you should be raising $1 million to give yourself a buffer, and don't take 300,000 and see what you can do with it. I've met a lot of startups that are still in their, call it early growth phase, but they've been there for 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, because they raised 100 grand and then they got somewhere, and then they raised 200 and then they bridged with another 100. And that's not what high growth looks like. High growth is like, we know we need $1 million and we're not going to stop. We're going to find the $1 million, and then we need 5, and then we need 15, and then we need to raise 50. And that's what high growth looks like. It's not these little rounds where you just kind of ebb and flow for many years.
Mm-hmm. And I can imagine the amount of time and effort it takes to keep raising all those little amounts is probably, taking so much energy anyway.
It's exhausting. That's right. It really takes its toll.
Mm-hmm. Question here from Jono. How important do you think it is to use a US-based salesperson or business development when you're just entering the US market?
It really depends on what you're selling and how important it is for that person to be on the ground. I think if you're doing, let's call it enterprise or even medium-sized business, and those definitions have kind of changed a little bit with which market you're in. The US is a big market, and enterprise can be gigantic companies. But I'd say if you're doing anything on kind of mid to enterprise level sales, B2B, then it's very important. You're going to need somebody there. Those sales cycles are long. You're going to need somebody in the same time zone. You're going to need somebody who can show up in person. Half of sales is showing up, not just showing up to a Zoom meeting, but it's showing up in person. It's being willing to go the distance for a long period of time. Some of my sales cycles were anywhere from 9 to 15 months long for some of my bigger deals. And that's because they involved multiple people. Some of them might have involved 12 or 15 people to buy in. And a good salesperson has to be able to manage that. They have to know each of those personas. They have to know what those people care about. They have to be curious and figure it out, and then come back to the team and see if the product can actually do what the customer is asking for, or the potential customer is asking for. So those are more complex sales. That's where I would say definitely it's important to have somebody on the ground. And that first hire, I'll go ahead and add, I learned this term from one of my mentors, the Renaissance rep is a great theme to think about as your first sales hire. It's not only somebody who understands the ins and outs of selling. And to me, this isn't somebody who's worked in corporate, who's a corporate SVP for a large company. Those processes are very different. It's somebody who understands critical thinking. It's someone who can creative problem solve. Because at this point, so much is green fields. You need somebody who's inquisitive and curious, who's really trying to still market validate, even if you think you're ready to sell, because that feedback, that person is the ambassador, is the first point of contact to the company for everything, right? The pricing's too high, the product doesn't quite work. Like, that person has to have their game on all of those topics, so they can say, oh, product leader, this is what I learned. Here's my write-up. CEO, this is what I learned in terms of our pricing. It's not quite right. Engineering leader or clinical leader, this is what I learned. Can we validate on this in this area, right? So that first sales rep on the ground is really an information gatherer as much as trying to close deals. Now, to counteract that a little bit, if you have a product-led growth strategy, if you're not necessarily selling enterprise, maybe it's a B2C healthcare startup, maybe you're just selling to small businesses, then you might not need somebody on the ground, right? You might actually be able to do it remotely, or you might choose to pick somebody who's on the ground simply for the logistics, for the time zone differences and the day differences, but they're still doing it remotely. Either way, what I'll say is, if the core team is here in New Zealand, or maybe spread across Asia Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, it's really important, really do your homework on what it's like to have a remote hire. That can also be very lonely. It's really important to involve them, not just on Zoom happy hours and things like that, but really make them a part of the culture. Otherwise, they are going to burn out, or they are going to leave, and then you're just going to have to find somebody again.
Yeah, no, that's some really good advice. Question, what opportunities do you see globally for Aotearoa to share and sell health or disease prevention knowledge digitally to consumers?
To share for Aotearoa, to share, or read that last part again?
To share and sell health or disease prevention knowledge digitally to consumers.
I see a lot of potential here. I think whenever there is a difference in, call it ideology, and I know we're talking about health, but one of the things here that I continually love is so many Kiwis they think about kind of call it an eco-friendly, they have an eco-friendly mindset naturally. And I don't know where it comes from, but there's so much waste in the US, and we pollute so much more than the size of the population we have. So like that, I would say there's a lot of potential for the health ideologies, the health research, maybe it has something to do with the Pacifica Maori culture here, and how health plays into that, to be able to share that. Whenever there is a unique difference that can be valuable to many, I think there's a great potential. It all comes down to, for me, like, ideas are easy, the execution is hard, right? It's what is that idea? How do you make sure it's actually valuable? It's not just a guess. And then what does that thing that you're offering, a product or a service, actually look like?
Awesome. A question here, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, Dudley, if that's correct, says, hi Zach, we're a startup in our 3rd year of our journey. Sea Level is a patented technology that removes seasicknesses using a portable VR headset within minutes, and they're also based in Christchurch. We have a large defence contract underway and are looking for seed funding round 2. My question is, do we focus within New Zealand or Europe, as most of our clients are in Europe? No, we do have a satellite office in the UK too.
Got it. Good question. This one is more nuanced. I'll try to answer it as succinctly as I can. But I think for the other people listening as well, this is a good time to mention an acronym. Ideal Customer Profile, or ICP, is something I learned early and has been key at different points of my sales journey. The ICP is really the input criteria of how you define your customer at any given time. And so your ICP changes as you mature as a business. And this is an exercise I go through with some of my advisees and consulting clients, is to really understand where your customers are, what problem you solve for them, define them by the revenue they earn, or the size, or the departments they have, the technology limitations, the legal requirements. All of these things will help you define your customer. So Dudley, to help you answer your question, I would also give you an exercise that I've given to people, which is called a problem customer grid. And essentially, to describe it to the audience, you have 4 columns and you pick 4 different types of customers. And then you have 4 rows and you pick 4 problems that you could solve for them. And then across, so you have 16 squares. And the square that you want to focus on is the problem for the customer that you solve the very best right now. The rest is noise. And then everything on your commercial strategy, the product strategy, focuses around that. If you say, well, we could kind of do this pretty well in this cell, and this one we could do in 6 months, none of those matter. All that matters is, like, what are we really, really good at solving right now, and for whom? And if the answer is a customer type that is in the UK, and you can extrapolate on that, and there are more of those customers in the UK, or maybe they're in Europe and the UK is a good jumping off point, or the legal requirements of GDPR are important, and you're doing that for this customer, and therefore you want to expand in the UK before going to the US where there are different requirements, then yeah, I'd say, like, continue focusing there. The UK is far away, time zone and flight wise, but it's manageable. You know, don't be put off by the distance. Companies all over the world are bridging that distance in some way, shape, or form.
Awesome, cool, great answer there. Question here from Matt. This one's a little bit more, okay. First time founders designing an SAMD. I don't know what that means. Do you know? Class 1 products. Does it ring a bell to you?
I don't know what SAMD stands for, but I'm guessing medical device, MD, medical device.
Matt, feel free to check in the chat if that is correct. And it continues. FDA have said they will not enforce compliance, but this still feels very scary, especially testing prototypes. Do you have any advice, and should we think about the US market later when the MVP is iterating? Or so yeah, I think saying the FDA is saying it's okay.
Got it. Okay. So I would kind of answer back with a question. If it's the FDA that has said that, you want a formal letter from them. You don't just want an email. You want to make sure it's from the FDA, not an FDA consultant. There are people who have worked for the FDA or understand regulatory process. They aren't the FDA. That's just their opinion. Opinions can change, right? You could get somebody else at the FDA who it's a subjective process, unfortunately, who could say, no, I think that qualifies as a medical device. You're going to need a regulatory approval, 510K approval, blah, blah, blah. That's when you want that letter from the FDA with a date and a name and a signature and saying like, look, I have this. Your agency has already gotten back to me and said, I don't need to do this. Then they will probably back off. But otherwise, without that, you're likely to have to go through it again, and it's your word versus theirs, and your word's going to lose unless you have some kind of very hard proof. But I wouldn't provide yourself the safety net of testing and going down an operational path in case you had to get that regulatory approval. That's so much work and it's so much money. It's a distraction from what you really need to do. Spend your time, get that proof, and then move on as though it's chiseled in stone.
Awesome. A question here from Lisa. As a founder with very limited capital and support, how can us little people get into incubation? As some incubations do have requirements for revenue and such. So yeah, I was just wondering if there's any shortcuts or what advice you'd give for someone who might not qualify for like an incubation accelerator.
Sure. Yeah, so I think it's good to talk about incubators versus accelerators and define those for the group. Incubators are really an earlier stage to an accelerator, as you might guess from the name. Incubators, in my experience, are like Y Combinator has a lot of fame. That's really an accelerator. Incubators are really to take ideas into a certain stage. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the same stage. So I would argue that if you have a valid idea and you have some proof behind it, then an incubator should be able to take you, even if one of their requirements is revenue. Now, that's not a fair criterion. If I am a medical device designer, I'm not going to see revenue for years because of that regulatory pathway. But I might have testing traction. I might have clinical study data. I might have letters of intent signed from people who will buy once I do have that regulatory approval. So I would go back to an incubator that you're interested in and really dig into, why is this a requirement? What are other requirements? I have validated my process and I've done my market validation. I've done my product validation. Can I submit this as proof? Almost think of it like, when you go to get a visa for travel overseas, or if you have to get some official government document, they say, well, you can provide your passport or your license or this type of license or a marriage certificate or, right? Think of it that way. Don't be put off by, oh, it says revenue and I can't join, right? Always be creative, always hustle a way in. If it's something you want to be a part of and it's going to be helpful to your company and your growth, fight for it, find another way in. That tenacity speaks for itself. And if I were on the other side, I'd say, this person isn't going away. Yes, we have this requirement, and maybe we're not going to change the requirement, but we're going to make an exception.
Yeah, awesome. No, that's some really cool advice. Question here from Alan. Are you aware of any medtech software companies succeeding with a flat fee business model, e.g. $99 per month, regardless of what their business side is?
A flat fee business model? Sure. I mean, that's basically a flat per user per month charge, or per member per month charge, as it's often called. I think a lot of companies scale. I'd be curious to know why it's flat, because to me, the reason companies have different pricing tiers is part of their growth strategy. And so there are lots of different pricing strategies. I'll just go into a few here that might be helpful. One is penetration pricing strategy. So that's really where, if you want to grow the traction and adoption of whatever it is that you're selling, you might price it really low or even make it free because you care about adoption more than revenue, right? If you're doing a value-based pricing, you might say the value is equivalent to this thing, which it doesn't look like at all in terms of its technology, but it delivers the same value, so we're going to price it the same. Another pricing strategy might be a cost basis pricing strategy, where you say, our overhead is this, and our servers are this, and our device costs this, and we need to make a certain amount of margin, so this is what our total price might be. So the reason I go there with pricing strategies is I'm wondering, why flat? Maybe you haven't considered pricing strategy. Maybe you just kind of picked something and it's working. But are you alienating a group of people who could get started for cheaper, which would boost total revenue more than it would create more work? Are you underselling yourselves and the value that you have to larger customers who would be willing to pay more for your product? But to answer the question, yes, I have seen a flat price work.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Cool. Next question from Steve. I used to work in ICD-10 coding back in the 2000s and saw opportunities for preemptive tools for hospitals. Have you seen any tech solutions that use AI and machine learning to embed within the hospital systems?
Yes. So ICD-10, for the rest of the audience, this is very specific to the US. The ICD-10 coding is basically a massive database of how to code. There's also CPT codes, how to code different procedures, different products. Insurance, a little bit of lesson on the US. Healthcare insurance is often privatized. There is government health insurance as well, but many people, if they have health insurance, have private health insurance, and the health insurers need a code to know how to bill. So hospitals and clinics, they all use this system of like, well, here's the ICD-10 codes that we need for these procedures, this nurse's time, this surgical device, things like that. So the question was, have I seen AI machine learning in hospital settings?
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
I have. I think by the time I got out of medical devices, it was just starting to become new. I do stay on top of it a little bit with the US. It's really getting interesting. In fact, I'm working with a company now in Australia. I've been talking with them, and they're doing it around, they have an AI machine learning around billing. In fact, there's a lot of money that's wasted because the wrong codes are put in, and sometimes there's a manual process to correct and find the right codes. Oftentimes codes are missed, and so there's missed revenue that's just left on the table. So there's a company now in Australia that's using AI and machine learning to ease this process. There's a lot more in the US that are combining it with, call it the diagnostic machines that live inside the hospital. There's some that are doing it with machines that are more consumer machines that can be used in the home, but then they come to the hospital and they might download that data or sync up with what hospital systems have and their EHRs or electronic health records. So in short, yes, I think as funding reports show, there's just a ton of investment going into AI and machine learning, and healthcare in the US is a $3 trillion industry. So there's a lot happening there.
Yeah, awesome. What is the best way to explore what regulatory pathways you may need to consider for health software in New Zealand or abroad? So I guess that's like what resources perhaps?
Yeah. So I think it first starts really with your commercial strategy, where going back to that idea of the ideal customer profile and the growth that you need to achieve, I would, if I were in this person's place, I would say, okay, right, I've either raised a little bit of money or I need to raise money, but at some point I'm going to probably have to raise money again. I'm not just going to become a profitable company. How much am I going to raise is going to depend on what I can prove in terms of traction up to that point, right? So then I might say, oh, to get that traction, I need to define my ideal market, my ideal customer. My ideal customer right now is in Australia. So I need to look at regulatory approvals for Australia. I need to learn more about TGA. Now, CE marks, FDA approvals, TGA, they all have pretty good websites. At some point, it's like kind of doing your own taxes. Like it can be really complicated. So I recommend people start down the journey on their own to learn. It really helps to do a lot yourself. But then at some point, trying to find a consultant who has either worked at those agencies or an expert who has been through it themselves, potentially as an entrepreneur. For example, there's lots of people in the US who are director of regulatory, director of quality affairs, director of this and that. And they know that very, very well, and they'd be good guides. And some of them, you could invite them to be a mentor at an incubator if you're part of it, or, like there's a lot of ways to hustle without necessarily paying for that. But at some point, you need that advice from somebody who really, really knows the inner workings.
Yeah, Awesome. Now I'm just conscious we've just gone over the 4 o'clock mark, and everyone will probably have to jump off soon. There are a couple more questions remaining. Zach, do you still have a few more minutes if you want to?
I have a few more.
Yep. Okay, what's up on this one? Yeah, a lot of the social media noise indicates that VC funding is starting to get a little tighter. Do you see a market correction about to happen? I guess that's not specifically Healthtech focus, but
yeah. So I'll definitely say this kind of with the caveat of only having been here 9 months, but having talked to a lot of people who have been here longer. A market correction, I'm going to take that as kind of the valuation, at least in the US, the valuations are too high. And so kind of a correction back down. I think we're not going to see that for a little while in the US. If anything, I'd like to see a correction in New Zealand where the valuation is higher. I think right now it's a great time for investors and not as great a time for entrepreneurs. If I were an entrepreneur here, I would really think hard about what type of an investor I want on my board or I want behind me, whether I'm looking for, a book of business into the US, whether I'm looking for deep experience in my particular technology or area, but really fight for a founder-friendly cap table. Too many entrepreneurs, they agree to terms that make it really hard to raise later. So you kind of have to think of, I'm going to be raising 3, 4, 5 times in my career, maybe more. I need to think of the long tail, and this is just the first one. So if somebody takes too big of a piece here and they can't help me that much, it's going to make the rest of this pretty hard.
Awesome. Question. Yeah, perfect. So what's the best way to contact you after the webinar today?
Oh, yeah. There's probably the easiest way is through my email. It's, I don't know if we can put it in chat. Maybe you can do that for me, Lilia. It's Zach, Z-A-C-H at Zia Limited, Z-I-A Limited.com. You can also go to the zialimited.com website and you can contact me there. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn and message me there. So it's kind of whatever you're fancy, but email I'm probably fastest on.
Cool. And just, I noticed the remaining questions are ones that might need a bit more depth into. So if your question hasn't been answered, do feel free to flick it over to Zach afterwards if you are keen to grab an answer to that. But otherwise, I think we should probably wrap up because I notice a lot of people are jumping off now. I'm sure you've got some things to do too as well, Zach. So yeah, thanks so much for coming onto this webinar with us. This webinar has been recorded, so I will be uploading this onto YouTube, Spotify. Actually, they've got Spotify videos now, so not just podcasts, but you actually have the video there now, which is super cool. So I'll chuck it on there as well, and sharing that onto our LinkedIn page and website, territory3.community, within a couple of hours, or maybe tomorrow morning, depending how long it takes to process. But yeah, thanks so much for tuning in, Zach, and hopefully we're keen to see your progress over the next couple of months and years and see what you're working on.
Thank you, Lilia. And thanks for everyone for joining in. I hope it was useful.
Yeah, awesome, cool. Catch you guys later.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.